Chapter 6. Priya. I wish they wouldn't bow to me, Priya thought. Even in her own head, she sounded embarrassed. The waiting crowd of villagers, huddled together at the edge of the forest, and already bending forward into genuflections of respect, was large. Priya tried to keep her face impassive. She straightened her shoulders and held up her chin, trying to look proud, ready. But it was difficult. Perched as she was in an unveiled palanquin, her legs crossed beneath her, her back straight, as if she were some noble lady instead of, well, herself. She hated the palanquin. Alighting from it always felt like an embarrassing affair. There were always eyes on her and cheers. Sometimes fresh petals were scattered on the path before her. Today there was an older woman with a basin at the ready who offered to bathe Priya's feet as a gesture of respect. Priya rejected the offer with as much disgrace as she could muster, which wasn't much. Spirits, she hated politics. Hated smiling sweetly and pretending she wasn't sweating through her fine pale sari. She adjusted one of the wood and gold enameled cuffs on her upper arms, resisting the urge to fidget with the seam of her blouse. It was getting tight. She'd developed new muscle in the last months, ever since she'd started training in earnest alongside her sister's guards. She'd have to let the seam out, or get one of the maids to unpick and re-sew it for her. Gundam's ungainly jump down from his own palanquin blessedly distracted the crowd's attention from Priya. He straightened up awkwardly, offering the villagers a stilted greeting. This was his first time accompanying her, and as soon as he'd found out about the palanquins, he desperately tried to avoid riding in one. "You want those poor men to carry a big ox like me?" he asked, when it had been brought to him at the mahal's entrance. He gestured at the guards waiting by the palanquin, all of them smaller than him by far. "Why torture them when I can walk?" "Because we have to present a certain image," Priya had said. "We need to look grand." Gundam's expression had been skeptical. "I think," he said slowly, "that packing my body into that little palanquin won't make me look grand. People will laugh." "They wouldn't dare," Priya said, and then, with a sidelong glance at some of the watching guards, she raised her voice and said, "But if we refuse the palanquin, I suppose we can both walk." "Absolutely not!" The voice had come from one of the latticed windows above them, through the bands of wood. Priya had seen her sister's face narrow-eyed, staring down at them. "Priya, you're taking the palanquin." A pause. "Both of you." Gundam had grimaced, even as Priya had smiled in return, all teeth. Sometimes, often, she forgot that she wasn't meant to like him. "Well, Elder Bhumika has spoken," Priya had said cheerfully. "Cheer up, Gundam. Maybe if you keep on accompanying me, someone will build you a bigger palanquin." Now Gundam moved to stand beside her. He let her lead, allowing her to greet the chiefs of the village and accept the sparse garlands they offered, and the cups of sweetened milk, covered with a thin filigree of saffron. He let Priya nod and smile and pretend at grandness, and when she said, "Will you show us to the fields?" Gundam heaved a small sigh of relief and followed behind her. Niceties were excruciating, but work and the rot they both understood. The field they were led to was half marsh, and laden with deep green water rippling with algae, plant life, insect larvae, and small, strange darting fish, glimmers of onyx and silver in the dark. The croak of frogs sounded in the air. The water smelled stagnant, both bloody and sweet as sugar, and honeyed and unnaturally sweet. One of the village elders told them, with some anxiety, that the field had long served them well. Their village sat not far from it, the houses perched on stilts to keep them clear from the regular floods. There were families that had cared for this land and its waters for generations. The insect larvae were a delicacy, and exquisite when fried in oil and dipped in sweet tamarind. In other circumstances, the elders would have offered the finest of them to Priya and Gundam as respected guests. But of course, nothing from the marsh could be eaten right now. Nothing could safely be touched, for that matter. One of the village girls who regularly set her nets in the water had returned home with a rash on her arm. Overnight it had burst into small white flowers. The rot was in the marsh, in the plants, in the green algae on the water. That was why Priya had come, of course, to put it right. Well, to try to put it right. "Has anyone else become infected?" Priya asked one of the village leaders. He shook his head. No, elder, he said, and Priya, mindful as ever of her grandness, bit down on her tongue to avoid laughing at the absurdity of a man at least 30 years her senior calling her elder. We've been careful. We have other fields. The "for now" went unsaid. The rot spread. That was its nature. I'll see to her after then, Priya replied, and the leader murmured his thanks, his gratitude for her benevolence. The words pricked over her skin in a hot itch of embarrassment, but she nodded regardless and smiled and said, "If you could step back." Of course, the leader said hastily, and as one of the villagers stepped back and out of harm's way. Gundam and Priya stepped forward out of the marshy ground. "It's a tract of land," muttered Gundam, "and a lot of water." As they walked, Priya stared down. The algae on the water surface moved, a visceral pulse that spoke of lungs breathing and muscles contracting. The stench of it was unpleasantly metallic. It was drawing in flies. "It is," she agreed. "Have you ever—" "Nothing as large as this." She put right the odd tree, a small copse once and a great cost, no more. A pause. Then Gundam said, "Are you sure about this?" A deep breath. "Well, I have to try somewhere," she told him, "and you're here." "What should I do?" "Just watch for now," Priya said, because in truth she wasn't sure if there was anything he could do. She'd succeed or fail on her own. She took another steadying lungful of air and kneeled down. The mud immediately seeped through her sari. Maybe that would convince Bhumika that high-status clothing did Priya no good. A nice brown tunic and dhoti like the guards wore would be more suitable. Easier to clean, too. Focus. She closed her eyes, breathed, deep winding breaths. Mouth closed tight, she felt the hum of her own inhalations against her teeth, a subtle reverberation. Put some voice in it, and it would feel like a song. The rot hummed with her, every deep, fleshy strand of it nodded into the soil and the water, the green and the blue. It moved with her magic. As it should. She was a temple elder, after all. Elder Priya, thrice born. She had traveled 3 times through the holy deathless waters and survived. She had the gifts of an ancient yaksa in her, and whenever she closed her eyes, closed them as they were closed now, she felt the whole of Ahiranya like a winged insect beating its body against the cupped palm of her hand. This field, rot or no rot, was no less hers. She stretched out her magic, breathed, just so, reached for the rot. This was no different from fixing the rot in a mortal body. No different, she reminded herself, as the skeins of the sickness tangled and lashed and writhed around her. She could do this. She sank deeper. Distantly she could hear voices, Gundam's hand on her shoulder, 5 points of warmth, beams of light around the sun of a palm. Was he trying to call her back? Was the urgency in his voice? "Priya!" The roots of the rot wound around her. They had hollowed themselves a place in the earth, just as they hollowed a place inside the bodies of rot-riven mortals. She could not erase the rot in this field without murdering it entirely, but she had stopped its growth in human skin. She could stop it here. She reached deeper. "Priya! Priya! Oh, spirit's sake, fuck! Sapling! My sapling!" A hand on her jaw, tight grip. Wood-grain whirled fingertips, nails of thorn. Priya. Sapling. She rose to the surface of herself with the reflexive panic of a body on the verge of drowning. She lashed out, felt the soil churn and crack around her, sundered open. She heard a muffled shriek and the thud of a dozen footsteps as villagers watching from the edge of the field flinched back, caught between freezing and fleeing. "Priya." She recognized Gundam's voice, hoarse, careful. "Are you back with us?" Her eyes were opened, her vision cleared, like smeared glass rubbed clean. There was a blunt, winding rope, a noose of root, tangled around Gundam's throat. It was fairly tight. Priya swallowed, forced the noose to release. It slithered to the ground, back into the soil. The wet earth closed over it. "Yes," she said, voice thin and hoarse. "I am now." After a short rest and a cup of something sweet to soothe away the new tremor in Priya's fingers, tea this time, Priya attended to the village girl with the flowering arm. She placed her fingertips against the girl's skin and broke the power of the rot in her. She told the girl and her family that the rot would spread no further. "She'll live then?" the mother asked, voice small and tight with hope. "She will," Priya confirmed gently, and the woman broke down into tears. Untouched by the thrice-born's hands, the rot was a death sentence. The girl would always carry this small mark of magic on her, would always need to conceal it with long blouses and pluck away the petals with her fingers, so only the buds riddled her skin's smoothness. But she would not die. That, at least, was something Priya could do. There was nothing to be done for the field. Ganam used his own small once-born magic to help her build a barrier of trees around it, enclosing it from the surrounding fields and the village itself. Deep-rooted trees that ate moisture were best, so Priya poured her strength into forcing banyan after banyan from the soil. When it was done, she sat down on the exposed roots of one tree and chugged a carafe of water, exhausted, while Ganam explained to the village leaders that they would return if the rot escaped its carapace, that they could not fix it, that they were sorry, but even the temple elders of Ahiranya, newly empowered and ensconced, could only do so much. "Thank you," she said when he came back. "I don't think I was tactful enough," he muttered. "You were fine," Priya said. "True or not, what was done, she stood. "Come on, let's walk back." "What about the Palikins?" "We've already failed." She kept her voice light, dismissive, even as the shame of it curled into a hard knot of determination in her chest. "We don't need to pretend to be grand anymore." As if sensing her mood, the guards didn't try to force them back into the Palikins. They all walked together instead through the forest. Insects whirled in the air, so thick between the trees they formed clouds that undulated like dark gauze. The ground crunched underfoot. Ahead of the others, Priya and Ganam had no stick for beating the path to scare off snakes, as was customary, but there was no need for one. Ganam was applying his once-born magic to the carpet of leaves and twining flowers before them, shaking it in warning. It was a trick Priya had suggested to all once-born as a good method of refining their magic. The once-born, the rebels who'd fought and killed brutally for the independence of Ahiranya, had seized on the exercise as a way to hone their control. Ganam was one of the best. He moved the vegetation before them in elegant waves, a ripple that grew and spread like the aftershocks of a stone meeting the still water. So it was no surprise to Priya when he opened his mouth and said, "If you had help, maybe you'd be able to do it. Maybe it'd be easier." Priya was damnably tired. The mud on her knees had dried, crusted over into twin crescents of soil. She didn't want to have this conversation again. "Bhumika doesn't have time to help with things like this," she said. The once-born had magic, but it was nothing like the depth of the power that lay in Bhumika and Priya. Only the thrice-born could stop the rot in its tracks. Only they could do what Priya had tried, had hoped to do. Only they had a hope of curing the rot. "You and she don't have to be the only thrice-born," he said. "I know," Priya said. "I really do know. But we don't want, neither of us." She stopped. "It's dangerous." She wouldn't have dragged him along on these journeys if she didn't think that one day he'd pass through the waters. But her words came out of her clumsy. "No man or woman who fought at Ashok's side is unaware of that," he said. He didn't sound angry, but they'd had this argument often enough that she didn't need to look at him to know that a spark of mingled grief and fury had lit in his eyes. She felt the same thing, always, at the mention of her dead brother's name. "But we're not afraid to die for the sake of Ahiranya." "Maybe right now Ahiranya needs you to live for," Priya said as gently as she could. "We can't afford to lose anyone." Ganam said nothing. After a moment, Priya shook her head. "I don't want to argue," she said. "Let's just get back. There were plenty of time to argue in the future." "It sounds like it could have been a lot worse," Sima said later. They were sitting with their backs to a tree in the orchard. It was night, velvet and dark, and they had a carafe of wine between them. Probably, I just can't think of how right now. Priya didn't usually become maudlin when she drank wine, but it had been a trying day. She had been rambling on for some time, tracing the rim of the bottle restlessly, constantly with her thumb. "If I sat all day in a room and did nothing but tend to rot sufferers, I'd still barely make a difference. I'd be like like one ladle in a bucket the size of the world. You understand? Never try to become a poet, Pri, Sima said. She'd spent the day tending to the running of the mahal and was about as tired as Priya, but mellowed by liquor. She smiled a little. I was a poet to her, Priya said quietly, letting the confession slip free. I wrote to her, you know. How is your empress? Who knows? Priya shrugged. She suddenly felt a little exposed. Her face was warm, but we're not talking about that. You're the one who mentioned her. Look, she's not important. What matters is this, okay? I can't fix a field, said Priya. Not of rot sufferers. I don't mean field like I meant ladle, but oh, I should never have turned poet at you. You're right. Look, the plain truth of it is this. There's so much work to do, and I can't do it alone. The words exposed a hollow ache in her chest, a sheer knot of anxiety that she couldn't ignore any longer. We need more elders, more thrice-born. Sima exhaled. That's hard, Pri. Then she raised her hand and looked at Priya. What would you say, she said slowly, if I wanted to become more than I am? If I wanted to travel through the deathless waters like the mask keepers? Like you? Priya stared down at her hands. I don't think it's what you really want. Why not? You're not like they are. From the corner of her eye she saw Sima's shoulders tense, saw her visibly bristle. Quickly, Priya said, Not like Sima, not in a bad way. In what way, then? Let me take a drink, Priya said. Then I'll explain. They sat in taut silence as Priya swigged the bottle, taking 3 or 4 methodical mouthfuls. Her lips burned, her throat felt fiery. The kind of strength you need to pass through the waters and survive. It's a hard kind, a scarring kind. The kind of scars that sit inside your soul under the skin. She closed her eyes. I don't want that for you. I don't think you really want that for yourself either. You're too smart for that. It's pretty scarring to learn weapons too, you know, Sima observed. And the fear never really goes away. The guilt either. What's the difference getting a weapon that lives in your body instead of your hands? It's different, Priya said. Believe me. I've known hardships, Sima offered, and I'm willing to know more of it if it's for something worthwhile. Protecting the home we've built, the family we've made here. That feels worth it. You don't know the price, Priya said, and I... Her voice cracked a little. Something flickered through her. The image of a knife, a flower, wood, bones. They've already done it. Paid some of it. They can't go back. But it's not a price I'd ever want a friend to pay. What happens, Sima asked finally, when you enter the waters? What is it like? Priya laughed and shook her head. Drank another mouthful of liquor. She bit her lip lightly, fresh sour and liquor sweet. I'm not even sure I know, she said. I'm not even sure I remember. But there was one thing she was sure of from her time in the field of rot, from her sleepless nights after Ashok's death, from the whispers that flickered through her, sometimes in a voice as sweet and rich as a flowering rose. Oh, sapling. The waters remembered her.